A car, sleek and black, pulled up to the curb, and the tinted window rolled down. A voice called out from inside, "Sir, is everything all right?" The father turned toward the car, immediately recognizing the man inside, his brother, who had arrived after getting a panicked text from him earlier. The woman's face twisted with fresh panic. You called someone." The father narrowed his eyes. "I didn't know how this was going to go. And after what you did, can you blame me?" Michael looked between them, understanding the gravity of what had happened. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice low. And in that moment, the air grew heavier, because for the first time, it wasn't just about the call to the police. It was about something bigger, something that wouldn't be fixed with a simple apology. And just when it seemed like the worst had already happened, something else was about to unfold that would change everything. The father's brother stepped out of the car, his expression unreadable as he took in the scene. His sharp eyes scanned the woman, then Michael, then the officers still lingering nearby. He didn't have to ask what had happened. He already knew. Michael let out a tense breath, rubbing his forehead. "Look, I know this has gotten out of hand, but I need to make something clear," he said, turning to his wife. "This wasn't just a mistake. You accused an innocent man. You could have put his life in danger." His voice was controlled, but his frustration was obvious. The woman swallowed, her face still flushed with shame. She opened her mouth to speak but hesitated. What could she even say? That she hadn't meant it. That it was just instinct? None of it sounded right anymore. The father exhaled, shaking his head. "People always think they're helping," he said, his voice low, tired. "But they don't stop to think about what happens next. What if the officers hadn't believed me? What if my daughter had been scared of me after seeing them question me like that?" The little girl was still holding his hand, her eyes darting between the adults, sensing the weight of everything happening around her. She tugged at his sleeve gently. "Daddy, can we go now?" Her words cut through the tension, and the father nodded. "Yeah, sweetheart, let's go." But just as he turned to leave, the woman finally found her voice. "Wait." The father paused, his jaw tightening. He turned his head slightly, waiting. She took a shaky breath. "I need to do more than just say I'm sorry." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the urgency in it was clear. "I want to make this right." The father let out a slow breath, glancing at his brother, then back at her. "And how do you plan to do that?" She hesitated, then turned to the officers. "I want to file a statement. I need to document what I did, and why it was wrong." The officers exchanged a glance, surprised. One of them nodded. "That's possible. We can document the incident." Michael looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "Are you sure?" She nodded, her hands tightening around the strap of her purse. "If I don't, I'll just be another person who walks away like it never happened." The father studied her carefully. He had expected an apology. He had expected excuses. But this was something else. He wasn't sure if it was enough. But for the first time since this started, he saw something in her face that told him she really understood. He didn't say anything else. Instead, he turned back to his daughter, squeezing her hand. "Let's go get that ice cream." As they walked toward the car, his brother following closely behind, the weight of what had happened still lingered. But there was something else now too. A shift. A small but real step toward something better. And as the woman stood there, watching them drive away, she realized this wasn't just about one mistake. It was about changing the way she saw the world. And for the first time, she knew she had to. As the father drove away, he glanced at his daughter in the rearview mirror. She was looking out the window, her small fingers drumming against the car door, lost in thought. He knew she was trying to understand everything that had just happened. She was too young to carry that kind of weight, but moments like this had a way of staying with you. His brother, sitting in the passenger seat, let out a long breath. "You good?" he asked. The father nodded slowly. "Yeah, just tired." His brother scoffed lightly. "I get it, but you handled that better than most would." The father didn't answer right away. He had spent years preparing himself for moments like these, but no amount of preparation made them easier. He glanced at his daughter again. I just don't want her growing up thinking this is normal. His brother nodded in understanding. She won't. Not with you raising her. The little girl suddenly spoke up. Daddy. Yeah, baby? She shifted in her seat. That lady, do you think she really learned her lesson? The father considered the question. He wanted to believe she had. He wanted to believe that people could change when they saw the truth for what it was. But he also knew change didn't happen overnight. I think she's trying, he said finally. And sometimes, trying is the first step. The little girl nodded, seeming to accept that answer. Then she smiled softly. Can I get 2 scoops of ice cream instead of 1? The father chuckled, the tension in his chest loosening just a little. Nice try. His brother laughed. Come on, man. After the day she's had, she deserves it. The father sighed dramatically. All right, fine. 2 scoops. The little girl cheered, and just like that, the heaviness of the moment began to fade. There would be more conversations, more questions, and maybe even more difficult moments ahead. But for now, they were okay. And that was enough. Back at the park, the woman sat on a bench, staring at the ground as Michael sat beside her. She had given her statement, and the officers had left. The weight of everything was still pressing down on her, but for the first time, she wasn't looking away from it. Michael finally spoke. So what now? She exhaled. I don't know, but I need to do better. He nodded, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Then start there. She let out a small breath, knowing that nothing she did would erase what had happened. But maybe, just maybe, it could be the beginning of something better. It was supposed to be just another peaceful afternoon at the park, a father and his little girl laughing, playing, and enjoying the sunshine. But then, out of nowhere, everything took a sharp turn. A woman, watching from a distance, narrowed her eyes, gripping her phone tightly. Something about the sight of this black man with a young white girl just didn't sit right with her. Her assumptions kicked in, and before she knew it, she was dialing 911. Hello, yes. I'd like to report a suspicious man with a little girl. I think she might be in danger, she said, her voice laced with urgency. On the other side of the park, unaware of the call being made, the father was busy tying his daughter's shoe. The little girl giggled, playfully nudging him. Daddy, can we get ice cream after this? She asked, her face lighting up with excitement. Of course, sweetheart, he smiled, patting her head. Minutes later, the sound of sirens cut through the air. Police cars rolled up, and officers stepped out, scanning the area before locking eyes on the man. Confused, he looked around, wondering what was happening. Then they approached him. Sir, we need to talk to you, one officer said, his tone firm but neutral. The little girl's eyes widened as she clung to her father's arm. Daddy, she whispered, sensing that something wasn't right. The woman who made the call stood nearby, arms crossed, watching as the officers surrounded the man. In her mind, she had done the right thing. She had protected a child from what she believed was a dangerous situation, but she had no idea what was about to unfold. As the officers questioned the man, he remained calm but visibly shaken. He explained who he was, why he was there, and most importantly, who the little girl was. But despite his words, doubt lingered in the air. The woman, now feeling justified, spoke up. I was just trying to make sure the child was safe. You never know these days. The little girl looked up at her dad, her brows furrowed in confusion. Why are they asking you so many questions? She asked innocently. One of the officers sighed, glancing at the woman before turning back to the father. Do you have any proof that she's your daughter? The father reached into his pocket, pulling out something that would change everything. But by the time the truth was revealed, it was already too late for the woman who made the call, because in that moment she realized she had made a huge mistake, and the regret, it hit her like a ton of bricks. But what exactly did the father show them? And how did the woman react when she finally understood the truth? Well, you're about to find out. The father took a deep breath, his hands steady as he pulled out his wallet. His fingers slipped into a slot, retrieving a small but powerful piece of identification, his daughter's birth certificate. He held it up, his eyes locked onto the officers, silently pleading for reason to take over. The officers leaned in, studying the document carefully. The name, the birth date, and most importantly, the listed parents all told the same undeniable truth: this little girl was his daughter. But before the officers could respond, the little girl spoke up, her voice small but firm. "Why are you asking my daddy all these questions? He didn't do anything wrong." The woman who made the call shifted uncomfortably. Her confidence, which had once been solid, was now cracking. Her eyes darted between the officers and the man she had accused. She had been so sure that something was wrong, that this couldn't possibly be his child. But now, faced with cold, hard proof, doubt was creeping in. One officer cleared his throat and turned to the woman. "Ma'am, can you explain exactly what made you call us today?" She hesitated, suddenly aware of how this was turning against her. I just thought it didn't look right. A black man with a little white girl, alone at the park. I was worried for her safety." The words hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. The father let out a slow exhale, his grip tightening on his daughter's hand. He had heard it before, the assumptions, the judgment. But this time, it was different. This time, his little girl was witnessing it firsthand. The officers exchanged glances, and one of them sighed. "Ma'am, making a report based on an assumption like that's not okay. This man did nothing wrong." The woman swallowed hard, suddenly feeling exposed. She hadn't expected this. In her mind, she had been protecting a child. But now, standing here, she was beginning to see that what she had actually done was something else entirely. The little girl turned to her father, confusion in her innocent eyes. "Daddy, why did she think I wasn't yours?" His heart clenched at her words. He crouched down to her level, brushing a stray hair from her face. "Some people don't always understand families like ours, sweetheart, but that doesn't change the truth." The woman's face turned red as she took a step back, her mind racing. She had made a huge mistake. And as the officers continued speaking to her, it became clear there were consequences for jumping to conclusions. But just when it seemed like the situation was winding down, something else happened, something that no one expected. And in that moment, the tension only grew thicker. The woman's face was still flushed, her hands gripping her purse tightly as she took another step back. She could feel the weight of the officer's stares, the father's silent disappointment, and worst of all, the little girl's innocent confusion. The truth had unraveled before her eyes, but instead of relief, all she felt was an unsettling regret twisting in her stomach. One of the officers sighed and turned toward the father. "Sir, we're sorry for the inconvenience. You're free to go." His voice was professional, but there was something else there too, an understanding, a quiet frustration with how this had played out. The father nodded, his jaw tight. He wasn't surprised. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened, and deep down, he feared it wouldn't be the last. But what hurt the most was that his daughter had to witness it. She was too young to carry this kind of lesson, yet here she was, eyes darting between the adults, trying to piece it all together. The woman, still standing there, finally found her voice. I didn't mean to." But the words felt empty, even to her. She had meant to. She had called the police, fully believing she was doing the right thing. But the truth was, she hadn't been protecting anyone. She had only acted on her own bias. The little girl, still holding her father's hand, looked up at the woman with wide, searching eyes. "Why did you think my daddy took me?" Her voice was soft, but her words hit harder than anything else that had been said. The woman's lips parted, but no words came out. How could she explain? How could she tell this little girl that she had let fear and assumptions take over? That she hadn't even stopped to consider another possibility? The father stood, placing a protective hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Come on, sweetheart, let's go." His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. Not anger, something deeper, a tiredness that ran beyond just this moment. As he turned to leave, the woman felt a strange panic rise in her chest. She wanted to fix this, to take it back, to say something that would erase what had just happened. But it was too late. The damage was done. One of the officers turned back to her. "Ma'am, we need to talk." His tone was firm now, no longer just questioning but holding her accountable. She swallowed hard, suddenly realizing that maybe she wasn't walking away from this as easily as she thought. Meanwhile, as the father and daughter walked away, the little girl held his hand a little tighter. "Daddy, are people always going to think we don't belong together?" His heart ached at the question. He glanced down at her, seeing the worry in her small face, and forced a smile. "No matter what anyone thinks, we know the truth. That's what matters." But even as he said it, the weight of the moment lingered. Because deep down, he knew this wasn't the last time they'd have to prove what should have never been questioned in the first place. And somewhere behind them, the woman was just beginning to understand the true consequences of her actions. As the father and daughter walked away, the tension in the air was still thick. His grip on her hand was firm, reassuring, but inside, his mind was racing. How many more times would they have to go through this? How many more strangers would look at them and assume the worst? He had always known the world wouldn't see their family the way they did, but standing in the middle of a park, questioned like a suspect in front of his child, it stung in a way he wasn't sure would ever fade. Behind them, the officers continued speaking with the woman. Her confidence had crumbled completely now, and for the first time, she truly felt the weight of her actions. She wasn't just someone who had made a simple mistake. She was someone who had called the police on an innocent man. And now, as she stood there, the realization sank deeper. What if this had gone differently? What if the officers hadn't approached him calmly? What if her assumptions had led to something far worse? "I thought I was helping," she mumbled, but even she didn't believe it anymore. One of the officers shook his head. "Ma'am, this could have ended badly. We need to make sure people understand that calling 911 isn't something you do just because something looks off to you."